Designing user-friendly documents, making life easier anyway. Um, so it's very important that your documents are user-friendly. If you think about design, it definitely affects usability, and that's things like the font, typography, use of white space, and all other visual elements. Once again, this is related to the audience and purpose. You want to analyze the audience and purpose, as noted earlier, and this should come first when deciding on your document design. So in other words, your design should meet the needs of your customer and should not be your personal preference. There are some characteristics of well-designed documents. Um, audiences have expectations, and here are four of them for document design. It should be inviting and accessible. It should work as a single cohesive unit. It should form a visual hierarchy and should take a wide range of people into account. Um, so, in a nutshell, the document should make sense and should be easy to read. Here's an ineffective page design. As you can see, there's no title. The margins are small. The gigantic paragraph, and there's no white space. So in other words, it's all a jumble and it's very difficult to read. And of course, then it's very difficult to take and use that information for anything useful. Here's an effective redesign of the same document. As you can see, there are good headings. You can see that it's one cohesive unit. And there's a bulleted list that breaks up the paragraphs. And it just makes sense, and it's easier for the reader to get a handle on the information that you're trying to get across to them. In other words, it achieves its purpose. There's some specific design elements, and there's designs for consistency and cohesiveness. And you think about stuff like grid patterns, margins, paragraphs, justification, white space, line spacing, font, style, and size. It should be easy to see. Things should be broken up into chunks. The information should be obvious. It should be easy to use. There are some examples of grid patterns. Any of those could suit your purpose depending on what you wanted to do with your document. Here's an example of justified and unjustified text. Once again, there might be different reasons for it. It could be from a formal report, from a memo. Depends on what you want to do. White space is very important. You want to isolate paragraphs. You want to have breathing room. You want the reader to be able to understand that there's a new idea. And then, of course, there are many different font styles. And as you can see, you want to avoid decorative fonts. So, as my basketball coach used to say, don't get cute with what you're trying to do. Some strategies. You want to think about consistency and cohesiveness. And I already talked about grid patterns, margins, and paragraphs. Basically, you want to have adequate margins. You want to use the same kind of grid pattern throughout the document. So you might want to have a consistency. For example, I have to have a design for my online class, and I try to use the same pattern every single time for every lesson. So there's consistency in how I'm doing it, and there's consistency in the reader's mind so that the students know what to expect relative to format. Paragraphs can be varied in length, and it says avoid orphans and widows. In other words, paragraphs should all make sense together. We talked about justification. You should use plenty of white space. It should be used consistently once again. And you want to think about what your line spacing and indentation should be. And once again, that should also be consistent. When you talk about font size, you should use something that is relatively professional. It should be the same throughout. And use things like italics, boldface, all caps selectively and sparingly. And the reason you do that is because when you use it, you want it to stand out to the reader. If you use it too often, then they will not focus on the things that you're trying to emphasize. Other things to think about, you want to have headings. You can use color, and in the example that we use, they use blue color for the boldface or to make sure that differentiated between sections. once again, in my online classes, I use red oftentimes for something I want to make certain that people read. I will make it a little bit larger. You can use bulleted and numbered lists. They're a good way to break up the information into chunks once again. And of course, if it's something's a little bit more formal, you'll use tables of contents and indexes. There's some example of color headings, color tabs, color sidebars, callouts. These draw the reader to them and express to the reader, hey, there's something important that you need to look at. Here's some other examples of using color for emphasis. Here's the difference between bulleted lists versus numbered lists. And you can see when you do things in text as opposed to bulleted list, it's a little bit easier to organize and easier for the writer to digest that information, or the reader to digest that information. We have running heads and footers. As the class goes on, we will be talking about APA formatting. And in APA formatting, you have running headers. If you know how to use Microsoft Word effectively, it's pretty easy to do, but you can download templates that already have the header and footers and everything put into them. And this goes for all styles, all ways of formatting your papers or formatting documents. And so that can be done relatively easily. Other things you want to think about, navigation and emphasis. Once again, headings should be consistent, logical. You don't want to have too many, and you don't have ones that are not connected to the main purpose of your document. You can use color as needed. Don't use it all the time, of course, for the same reason. And you can use shading, bold, italics, and underlining when you need to emphasize something. Bulleted lists and numbered lists are good ideas. Don't overuse them, but they can be appropriate and a good way to chunk information. And you should have oftentimes running headers or footers. You should always include page numbers, and it's a good idea to break up your documents into sections and chapters. Finally, if you think about table of contents and indexes, lots of documents use them. And if you do something pretty formal, so for example, if you had to do a proposal for a business, you're probably going to have table of contents, indexes, that sort of thing, because it's a formal document.